Thank you for coming. Explain this, the genesis of this series of lectures. I taught last fall a series of classes that were, I think it was 4 classes on the history of modern Orthodoxy, and I sort of tried to tell the story of our community from its origins, focusing on a couple of key issues: the fight over Mechitza in the 1950s, the day school movement in the 60s, the women's tefillah as it emerged in the 70s and 80s and 90s, the polemics of the 90s, and then into some of the debates and polemics of our community in the 21st century. And I thought it'd be interesting to then follow up and sort of address some of the frontiers of modern Orthodoxy, where some of these conversations are going right now, what's happening at the periphery of our community, and what maybe a little bit inward of that periphery. What are some of the issues on our community's religious halachic agenda? And so there's sort of 4 topics squeezed into 3 weeks. I think for each of the topics I want to try to, so that's a series as a whole, so I hope you'll join, come to all of them, I hope. And tonight we're looking at gender, where I think, which is mostly going to be about issues of about feminism, Orthodox feminism, and maybe we'll expand that conversation a little bit. Next week is sexuality, and then the following week is heresy and postmodernism. So these are very big topics. There's like a semester for each one. We're going to maybe next year, but we'll try to like just cover some like even just some like Rosh Prakim, some chapter headings at least, and sort of name them. So tonight I see like 3 major issues on the kind of have been on the Orthodox feminist agenda for 2 generations at least. One is Aguna activism, one is increased ritual involvement for women in the context of synagogue life or home ritual life, and the third is religious leadership, Torah study and religious leadership, okay? Which I guess that's 4 issues. I'm linking together religious leadership and Torah study for tonight. So that's like 3 issues. I think that I'm leaving. I guess there's also like the other issue, which maybe we'll deal with later, if not tonight, is sort of the philosophical implications of feminism, which which very few people are talking about in our community, but that's also there. Maybe we'll say some words about that. I guess. There's also, I think the other, of course, men also have a gender. Being male is also a gender. I think it's also something that could be explored, like the flip side of some of these conversations. What does it mean to be a Jewish man in the 21st century in our community? I notice about our shul that parents of young children don't come to shul, except for Shabbat morning. That's almost a universally true rule. Sometimes you have parents of a child, but not parents of children, like more than one child under the age of 10. People in that category, like, I don't know, like quite a few, dozens and dozens of people in that category, hundreds probably of people in that category in our congregation. And between Shabbos morning and Shabbos morning, you might see 1 or 2 people in that category in our shul. So that, to me, that's interesting, right? That suggests that's like evolving gender roles, right, in our community, and that's that affects men and women, right? And child, and how we parent and how we share domestic responsibilities and what our marriages look like. And so I think there are like a lot more that can be said, but I think I want to. So maybe we can. I just said that's an observation. It's not really a point, but let's go back to the 3 points of this agenda. So first item, Aguna activism. So I want to start sort of more central to our community, like less peripheral, and then move towards the periphery, okay? So at the heart of our community, I'd say like in the last generation, we've seen the spread and success of the halachic prenuptial agreement in the United States, in the North American the United States modern Orthodox community. This is an agreement that was developed in the 80s and gained popularity in the 90s and has been incredibly successful in eliminating get recalcitrance in the modern Orthodox community. Just like by way of background, the Torah, as understood by the Rabbi, sets out Jewish divorce as something that's initiated by a husband, originally unilaterally, meaning without his wife's consent even. Over the centuries, that evolved somewhat. Divorce requires the woman's consent currently, but in the 20th century, so in the classical period, you had problems of husbands who vanished and without a trace, and their wives were left chained to these dead marriages without possibility of being able to move on with their lives or have certainty or closure to these marriages, and that's extensive literature, halakhic literature about those types of cases, which still occur from time to time. If you remember, a few years ago, Rabbi Reese came and spoke about the September 11th victims and proving their death to a sufficient degree that their wives could remarry or move on, right? And have that certainty, right? So that those cases still exist. There's extensive halakhic literature, but the modern agunah problem is husbands who just refuse to take part in the divorce process, and most commonly or most famously, infamously, out of spite or out of leverage to extract extra benefits from their wives in divorce negotiations. This is not appropriate according to Jewish law. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says even though the Torah gives a husband the right to divorce or not divorce his wife, if the marriage is over and then there's a mitzvah, an obligation to divorce one's wife and to accept a divorce from one's husband, and there's no right to hold on to that as a leverage, as a negotiating tool, as a weapon to express your revenge, whatever. It's not religiously allowed. It's become a significant problem. So the prenuptial agreement solves that problem by putting say this quickly because I assume you know this already or some of this, right? Puts a price on being married, right? According to Jewish marriage, because I'll say a husband has to provide support to his wife. If they're not living together, how is he supporting her? He's not, right? She's maintaining her own household. So in lieu of the Jewish law requirement of providing basic support for his wife, he has to pay $150 a day, whatever, $300 a day, whatever it is, which is not a fine. It's not a problematic pressure for him to divorce, which is not allowed in halakha. It's just a monetary price on his obligations as a husband. Okay, so that seems to shift the calculations of many of these husbands, and they give the get with less delay. When I discuss this with couples getting married, or I speak about this at weddings, I say it's like a vaccine. It's incredibly effective at reducing enormous suffering, provided that it's universal and assigned in every marriage, even in the majority of marriages where this will never be needed. And it's like a vaccine that's only helpful if you sign it before you need it. Okay? So we've made great strides in making it universal in our segment of the Orthodox community. And in fact, those who are doing more like on-the-ground agunah activism, they've found, and it's really a striking statistic, that their new clients are not coming from the modern Orthodox community. Like Aura, they're going to send a speaker here, in the winter. They have a Shabbaton with them. They have, maybe 200 clients or something. These are agunot, and they're working with them, providing legal aid, and they're having rallies outside their husbands, homes and businesses to pressure them to give their wives a get. They have clients who are from our community, but not new clients. At least they said, I don't know if it's true anymore, they said this like a year or two ago, that they are no longer receiving, no new clients in the last X number of years have come from the modern Orthodox community. So they're still accepting new clients, but they're not coming from our community because this prenup has sort of been very, very effective in that way. My suspicion is that the prenup is effective beyond the power of the document itself. It's effective as a statement of values that our community doesn't countenance refusing to give a get as a divorce negotiating tactic, and therefore it doesn't happen in the same way. Whereas in communities where husbands are encouraged, this happens, like husbands are encouraged, don't give her a get, this is your only weapon, the courts are biased against fathers, so use the get to get leverage to counterbalance that, et cetera, which husbands are told in some segments of the Orthodox community, so that's where you have people using the get as a weapon. In our community that's not countenanced, and so it doesn't happen. And so the document is maybe less important as the statement that we sign the document, we speak about it, we publicize it, and we have a clear articulation of our values.
What's the wording of the prenuptial agreement?
I'm happy to show you a copy. It's a 4-page legal document. For those listening, whatever, it's theprenup.org. You can see a whole website describing it, and I'll try to remember to send it to you. It's worth looking at. So the problem with people who are still, where's the problem? What's the role for agunah activism? What's is this issue just solved? I would say not for two reasons. First of all, there are vast segments of the Orthodox community that are not using this document, and those communities are producing agunot at whatever pace they are. Second, there's a concept in law called, I forget, I'm going to butcher the title, something like, if you're negotiating under, in the shadow of a power imbalance. You're not, there's sort of an implicit threat that is hanging over the air while the negotiations are taking place. And so even if the threat doesn't have to, there's a legal term for this, and this has been talked about in secular legal context as well. So the threat doesn't have to be made as long as the power imbalance is known and obvious to both parties to this negotiation. And since Jewish law gives such a power imbalance in favor of the husband, every divorce takes place in the shadow of this power imbalance, and even when the get is given in a timely way, the wife goes into these negotiations knowing that she's at such a disadvantage that the risk to her future is so very high that that can be quantified, and in aggregate that could be so she'll be quicker to agree to less favorable terms than she might have been able to win in some other legal system, right? In terms of negotiations, in terms of dividing property and custody and things like that, because she's at a power. So the prenup doesn't really solve that. It mitigates that, but doesn't really solve that. And there are people who studied, there's a group in Israel that they interviewed, I think several hundred, maybe several thousand women who had, Jewish divorces in the state of Israel over the past decade, and they uncovered quite a lot of these sentiments, really, that women were conscious of, just this fear and anxiety that was hanging over them as they were dealing with their divorces, and that skews the outcome in ways that are detrimental to women. So that's one place. So the prenup doesn't quite solve that, and that's one problem. And again, the other problem is if it's not signed, it can't help, and so there's a search for solutions that are what they call comprehensive, or that solutions that can be applied after the fact rather than just before the fact. As a rabbi I know, he said, we should just publicize the prenup really, really well, and then we should just say, you don't sign it, we don't care. Like any parent who doesn't, insist that their children sign a prenup, as far as I'm concerned, that's a form of child abuse, and we've done our piece, we have this great document, it solves the problem. If you don't sign it, don't come running to us in tears when if you're in trouble. So I don't think he was quite serious about that, but that was sort of like, he just felt this was such a powerful tool, and let's just get everyone to use it, and then we can be done. Problem is, it isn't always being used, and there are real human beings, like dozens or hundreds, maybe thousands of them, who are suffering a tremendous amount, and it's hard to just be callous and say, well, if only you signed the prenup, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, right? If only your rabbi hadn't dissuaded you from signing the prenup, right? Your parents had told you not to do it, etc. You'd be in a different situation. So there are searches for other solutions. So one solution is also a solution that only works in advance. This is something that various forms of modifications to marriage ceremonies to incorporate either kiddushin al tanai, that the husband will betroth the wife under the chuppah al tanai with a condition, a stipulation that they never live apart for 6 months, for example, right? Such that there'd be no need for a get if he disappears, or if they separate and either party refuses to take part in a get proceeding, because the kiddushin itself, the betrothal is with that stipulation explicit in front of witnesses at the time. There also, and then the flip side is, you can also, the husband can appoint agents to deliver a divorce to his wife at the moment that they get married under the chuppah, on condition that they live apart for 6 months. Right? So I could say, I hereby appoint any witnesses here at this wedding to go and authorize a get on my behalf to give it to my wife on condition that we ever live apart for more than 6 months. And that's also and then in combination, that's a pretty powerful, that could be and then they can also say, and if this, then the husband and wife can both say, the wife could say, she could say, they could both say, we are entering into kiddushin on the assumption that this works, and if this doesn't work, if a Beit were to say that these halachic stipulations are ineffective, we'd rather, in that case, we don't want to be married at all. And we're clearly stating that our marriage is on condition that, this document that we're agreeing to is effective halachically. And we'd rather not be married than, for it not to be effective. So it's a little more powerful in some ways. It takes the power, it really removes any imbalance, removes any power to the Beit. It doesn't require civil courts to enforce a payment, and so it's a little more powerful. I don't know that it's being done. It was, it seems to be, it's when this was introduced, it faced a lot of pushback, and so I don't think it's widely adopted, but it exists. The document is there, And I know there are some people who are using it with marriages they perform. Also, a few years ago, there was the formation of the International Beit, which is a specialized Beit focusing on resolving cases of abunot. And there have been several of these over the years. Rabbi Rachman had a Beit of this sort in Israel maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, that was relied on. It was not. I would say it was not widely. It was almost universally condemned, I think, as relying on flimsy arguments. I think the argument was any husband who would withdraw, who would withhold a get is some sort of sociopathic monster, and by withholding that information about himself when he got married, there was no full consent on the part of his wife, because had she known that her husband was the type of person who would withhold a get, she never would have married him. Probably that's my understanding of the type of arguments they were trying to make in this Rabbi Rachman's Beit. The problem is, I don't think it's not necessarily true that that type of character flaw is the type of thing that is like ingrained and knowable about oneself, or about before the time of marriage, as opposed to there was a case of or Moshe Feinstein has a case of a woman who discovered that her husband is gay, and had she known that, she never would have married him. So that's a little more. That's probably something that was like true about him before he got married. That's like an important piece of information about himself that he withheld from his wife. And had she known, it's also pretty reasonable that she wouldn't have married him had she known that. So that's maybe that type of argument is reasonable about something which is knowable prior to the marriage and clearly would be understood by almost everyone as being a flaw in the marriage, that she wouldn't have married had she known that. Whereas the type of person who would withhold a get, that's a little bit more amorphous. Okay? So the International Beit is started 3 or 4 years ago, and they've tried to do a better job, Rachman's Beit, in on the one hand being very, very really willing to take advantage of halachic arguments that had not been widely used in the past, and also, but also to be using them that are a little more solid than what Rabbi Rachman was reported to have used before. And they've also received a lot of pushback and a lot of controversy, but they're still existing, and they haven't backed down, and they have had, some rabbis of repute who've supported their work over the years. So and in disclosure, I'm studying some of these laws with them. Okay, so so that with a group of congregational rabbis, they've are trying to teach some of these halachot to try to help us understand the work that they do. So that's in full disclosure, but I haven't learned all that much yet, so I can't really tell you. At the end of the year, I'll know more about how they operate, I guess. But I guess what I have seen already is that a lot of what they do is not halachically innovative. They're just really singularly focused on solving these cases, these very hard cases, and also they're willing to apply halachic arguments that other Batei Din have been more resistant to apply in recent years. And the farthest periphery of our community, you find some people who've said, let's just do away with Kiddushin altogether. Right? Can't we find some other basis for a Jewish marriage besides Kiddush? Kiddush, it's such a powerful, potent halachic status that puts such risk on women and raises the stakes so high. Wouldn't be better off just avoiding it. And I think there are I don't know there are influential rabbis in the modern Orthodox community who have adopted that position, as far as I know. But I definitely know of people in our community or in the periphery of our community who have gone there. And I do know of rabbinic colleagues who dissuade if couples come to them and say, will you please marry us when you officiate our wedding, if the couple isn't Orthodox, they'll refuse, or they'll say no. Or they'll try to refuse or say no is the same thing. They'll refuse, or they'll try to dissuade them. Now listen, this is what Kiddushin is. It's very risky. It has all sorts of problematic associations. So you really want this? And one rabbi told me recently, he prides himself that he was able to, over the years, many, many couples, he's convinced not to have, him officiate their wedding. He says it's just safer. They shouldn't have an Orthodox. If you're not like committed to Orthodoxy, don't have an Orthodox rabbi officiate your wedding. It's just what do you need that for? And it just puts you at risk, down the road where So that's like halfway there. So the question is, well, why are you telling your Orthodox, couples that they should have this form of marriage? So they say, well, at least with them, they'll take it seriously. They'll, arrange for a get. If the marriage falls apart. But to me, this suggests an awareness that Kiddushin is a risky thing. There are also stories in Israel of rabbis, I don't know if it was maybe in generations in the past, rabbis would intentionally undermine the halachic validity of weddings they performed for non-Orthodox couples. Because they just felt, well, if there was a divorce, they won't necessarily get a get, and because, on kibbutzim, there's a lot of adultery, at least according to stereotypes, so why create trouble? Let's just, yes?
What are the risks beyond just the get issue?
So one risk is if the woman has sex with another man other than her husband without getting a get. That's one of the most severe prohibitions in the Torah. So let's say, I don't know, at least according to the stereotypes on a kibbutz, where that prohibition is not, like social adult, that's not a taboo that's very strong, so that people are at risk of, right, if they don't take that prohibition seriously, they're at risk of themselves. And then the get issue is a risk. And if she has children with another man, while still halachically married to her, those children are mamzerim, will have a terrible stigma and a difficult barrier to their own marriage. So it's a risk also to the next generation. So some of these ceremonies we'll each take an oath. We'll each make a neder or something that we'll be faithful to each other. We'll write a halachic contract to pool our resources, and we'll take a neder to be faithful to each other. And in this way, we'll avoid this problem. So this is, again, it's not an idea that doesn't have traction, but I feel like the rabbis who are deliberately undermining the validity of weddings they perform or dissuading couples not to have them perform their weddings, I feel are kind of acknowledging this position. I had a woman call me once prior to her wedding to talk through with me some of the halachic issues to make sure that under no circumstances would her wedding be considered a halachic wedding.
No.
This was, just like a very graduate of an Orthodox yeshiva education, who was a learned woman, and there was an agunah in her family. It was a very traumatic experience for her, and she was just, I can't have this in my life. And so that's why she called her, her friend, the yeshiva student, to be like, let me talk through my wedding. I want to make sure that whatever happens, no, rabbi would ever consider this valid kiddushin. I don't remember what, it was a long time ago. I mean, it was a Reform rabbi officiating. With not kosher witnesses, I think. There was, it's not that hard to,
Then isn't it also a problem if you're not married?
So I don't know. I mean, there's like a, maybe not. I mean, I think if it's a monogamous committed relationship, then maybe some of those halachic problems fall away, perhaps. But, and maybe if we all decided we would pivot to that, maybe it would not be a problem. I'm not there, I perform kiddushin, I make sure the weddings are halachic. I also am willing to do it for people who aren't particularly observant, but I also feel a responsibility to have them commit to seeking out an Orthodox divorce with a reliable Beit Din if the marriage falls apart. And I thank God they're all still married at this point, and I'm in touch with all of them to some degree, I guess. Yeah, so I'm trying to keep in touch with all of them, or I'm in touch with all of them, so I can try to be around to help make sure that happens if it should be necessary. Questions or comments on this before we go? Marilyn?
Rabbi Patton posted an article about a woman in Israel. She'd been divorced twice. Actually, she'd been divorced 4 times, married twice, but divorced one, because the rabbis there didn't recognize the first divorce, so she had another one. Same thing happened with the second marriage. So she met a man, and they decided that instead of being a wife, she'd be a concubine. Yeah. And they signed a contract that they have to renew every year.
Wow.
And they had 4 children.
Wow.
And I even made a comment. I said, it's sad the world has come to this.
Yeah, and that's sort of sad. Like, I mean, like, concubine is a halachic category. It exists in the Torah for, a couple who aren't married with kedushin. They don't seem to need a get, but I don't know. It's hopefully we can come up with something better. If that, I don't think that's taking off as a solution. But I think the idea of like staying, but the aversion to kedushin is definitely a phenomenon.
If you have that sort of agreement, are your children mamzer?
No. A mamzer is only a incestuous or adulterous relationship. Yeah.
Mamzer in California is a forbidden relationship.
A severely forbidden relationship, like a death penalty forbidden relationship, not a coed and a grusha is not a mamzer, right? So it's pretty. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Okay. Second issue on the Orthodox feminist agenda: ritual involvement. Okay, at home in the shul. So starting in shuls, what do we have? We have in somewhat mainstream Orthodox congregations, members of the OU, or they're not members of the OU, but they're congregations, they're Orthodox congregations. We have continued, I would say, tinkering around the edges, okay? Mm-hmm. Trying to saying a tefillah for this, or put a caricature of this place and that place, and there's all that kind of tinkering, which I don't mean to be. Tinkering sounds like I'm being dismissive. I don't really mean to be dismissive. I think small gestures can actually mean a lot. I realized that several years after I arrived here when, I probably shouldn't say this on the... when I realized just how fraught it was over who carried the Torah. Mm-hmm. Let's say on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and there were women who had come to feel very, very strongly about that honor that had been theirs maybe in prior years, that it would continue, okay? And it was just like men who sometimes get very, possessive over a certain kibbudim in the context of the shul, and I okay, wow, I guess we succeeded in something, there's, that people can fight over this too. That's, it's worth fighting over, okay? It matters to them, that sense of being honored by their congregation, being recognized publicly as an important person, being, etc. And in terms of some of the, I think there's some interesting, we're talking in our shul about ways in which, women's tefillah, which has existed since the 70s, in those shuls where it still exists, how can it be integrated, incorporated into conventional tefillah, especially for Shabbat of a bat mitzvah or Shabbat of a ufra of Shabbat kala. And there are, we're having a conversation in our shul about that. I know other shuls that have tried interesting models of, women's tefillah shachrit begins at X time, and the conventional meeting begins in this space at Y time, and then at Z time, the two of them meet for the Dvar Torah, and they have Musaf together, and this, and they swap spaces, or they, and there are several shuls I know of that are kind of thinking through in a very creative way efforts to, I would say, increase the prominence of a women's tefillah in the context of a shul, generally in the context of a bat mitzvah or an ufra or something like that. And there are a few different models, and they, all just trying to in a limited amount of space with a certain number of people, how can we make that work? Halakhically, none of this is at all interesting. Now, this is all just within the paradigm of women's tefillah that's existed since the 70s. What's new is trying to, instead of being something that meets in the library or in the Beis Midrash once a month, it's actually, or in someone's house, this is something that's going to be brought into the shul in a much more prominent way. That's more new, even though halakhically the stuff is a generation old. I know. Just recently, I know a shul in New York, which for a long time has had the Torah being carried through the Ezra Nashim by women, has switched to having that same woman then be the one to put the Torah away, which, it's a few steps, right? But it's a few steps for a woman, a giant leap for whatever. So it's a process and a lot of discussion in the shul, and I think that seems also like tinkering. That's maybe a little more significant, a little more, in terms of the aesthetics of an Orthodox shul, seems to me a little more challenging and novel. But as far as I know, there were no earthquakes and no denunciations in newspapers, so it seems to have, I think, happened successfully. Moving outside of the synagogues themselves, you have the continued presence of the partnership minyan model. As far as I know, there is no synagogue in the world that has adopted the partnership minyan model for itself, or even sponsored one. There are maybe 2 or 3 examples of partnership minyan that rent space inside conventional Orthodox shuls, including here in Skokie. And I think that the partnership minyan model burst onto the scenes about 20 years ago. This is a model of tefillah where women read Torah and receive aliyot alongside men in the morning, and women read Psukei de Zimra and Kabbalat Shabbat, but not Mariv or Shachrit or Musaf. And I don't know. I don't know how many partnership minyanim there are in the world. Dozens, I would think. I wonder. I guess I wonder, is it a stable model? Because some of the early partnership minyanim have kind of continued to evolve in a more egalitarian and less orthodox direction. And maybe that was sort of inevitable. Was it a stable kind of resting place? Once you're willing to operate beyond the bounds of what more mainstream Orthodox poskim are endorsing, what's keeping you inside the framework that you set for yourself? There are people. I know people who go to partnership minyanim but don't go to fully non-Orthodox, tefillah. It definitely exists. I think the movement as a whole, though, has not. I don't know that it's been successful in saying, these are our principles, these are our halachic decisions that we've made that are the basis for our community, and we're sticking with them. I think there's been a lot of continued evolution and tinkering, and I'm not sure it's been stable. But I also wonder, whose fault is that? I think part of the fault of it really is the mainstream Orthodox community, which has kind of pushed them away. And if you push people away, sometimes they go, or you push them. I think it's sort of like the opposite dynamic of, people talk about the slippery slope, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know what the metaphor is, the slippery slope, and then there's the, pushing people, out the window or something. Just because, slippery slope is I take a step in this direction, and I want to be moderate and careful, but it's whoa, and all of a sudden I end up someplace I didn't want to be, didn't expect to be. There's also the dynamic of, help me think of a metaphor, I've been struggling to describe this for years, of just because I'm I guess it's pushing something out. I'm peering out the window, and somebody comes up behind me and goes, whoop, pushes me out. Just because I'm interested in something, just because I'm turning, oriented in this, a certain general direction, why do you have to come up behind me and push me out the window? I think that's also a dynamic that exists. And so you wonder, could it have been, given that in the scheme of things, when you look at the spectrum of Jewish diversity and halachic diversity that exists, the disagreements or the halachic disputes between the partnership minyan world and more conventional Orthodoxy, it's fairly small. It's compared to other disputes and divides that exist in the world today. And maybe we could have said, we don't like this, we don't agree with it, but let's keep them close. Let's try to work harder to keep it maybe even in our shuls or certainly in our communities, and then maybe. They wouldn't have gone quite as far. Things could have, the last 20 years might have been different. So I think and this is a dynamic I think we'll see again with some of the other issues, maybe next week especially. I think for some people sometimes it feels easier, or they choose. I'd rather write you out of Orthodoxy than have to undertake the work of reconstructing my identity to keep you in. Right, it's about my identity if I keep you in rather than, right, and so easier for me to say that's not Orthodox, you're beyond our community, than to rethink what it means to be Orthodox in light of your presence in my community. Does that make sense? Okay? I fear that's happened as well. So, personally, I don't attend partnership minyan, but I don't have, I'm anti-partnership minyan. Okay, I think the fight against them has been maybe more destructive than whatever disagreements I have with them, and many of the flaws of the movement itself are laid at the feet of the institutional Orthodox, establishment that pushed them away with such vigor. So. So that's the purpose. So I'd say the partnership. That's I think beyond. I would say and more liberal, more egalitarian than the partnership menu. You have like the halakhically egalitarian world. I think they're pretty. They don't call themselves Orthodox. They don't claim to be Orthodox. They exist in a symbiotic relationship with Orthodox communities because they're too small to sustain themselves. But I don't know if that could be included in this. Right? They're very clear about rejecting denominational labels, whereas the partnership union world, many of them still care a great deal about being considered Orthodox, and consider themselves Orthodox, and have a lot of Orthodox affiliations in their life in general. I think the halachic egal world, the egalitarian egal world, I think that's not the case for them, my understanding. So I don't have much to say about that. That world, that's definitely on the periphery of our community. They daven with us and we interact with them, and but. Yeah, and I guess it'd be interesting to see where those boundaries lie. Yes, ma'am.
I'm old enough to remember before the conservative movement had women with getting aliyot.
Yeah.
So it started with a woman could only get mafter.
Mm-hmm.
Then, a woman could get anything but Kohen or Levi.
Right. And
then, only a daughter of a Kohen or Levi.
Oh, interesting.
And then we don't believe in tribes anymore.
Right. So I think there's a conservative rabbi in New York City named Jeremy Kamenofsky. He wrote a wonderful article in Conservative Movement Journal or something. I think it's called like Conservative Judaism or something. You can find it online from time to time. It's really worth reading. I strongly recommend it. It's called, I think the article's called Good Neighbors. In the 90s, he read the Eidah Journal and its successor journal Me'orot in the 90s, from the 90s. He read whatever. The journal existed for however many years it existed for, 5 or 6 years maybe. And so I read this article for the first time. I was still living in Washington Heights, so it must have been 2007. Okay, 2007, 10 years worth of these journals. He read 10 years worth of these journals, including the article about partnership minyanim, and he himself is a ordained conservative rabbi of at that time of a large congregation in New York. I think he still is there. And he's sort of comparing how exactly the conservative movement differs from liberal orthodoxy. And one of the examples he gives is just comparing the way in which the conservative movement underwent these decisions and changes in the 50s with the debate about partnership minyanim. And the conservative movement shuvot were 4 or 5 pages with maybe a dozen footnotes, whereas the partnership minyan shuvot that published in Me'orot in the Eidah Journal was hundreds of footnotes, and then a response with hundreds of footnotes, and then another response from the original author. Just the level of this is his evaluation, the kind of halachic seriousness of the Orthodox community he felt was like far beyond what existed in the conservative movement in the 1950s. That there was people, the authors of these tshuvot in liberal orthodoxy were writing for an audience that cared a great deal about the scholarship, about the Torah, about the halachic issues that were relevant for this discussion, and they just thought this wasn't true. In the conservative movement in 1950, nobody was observed. I mean, there was just not the rabbis weren't writing for educated, observant laity. With a rare exception, the conservative movement never had an observant laity. And so all of the debate, so there are some similarities in some of the same ritual practices have been considered and contemplated, but the communities are very different. Right? To have that debate amongst a community that is Shiva educated and observe Shabbos, and versus to have that debate around a community that isn't Shabbos and doesn't have a formal Jewish education that extends past 8th grade is a very different kind of conversation. It's a very good article. I think it's an excellent article. If you have trouble finding it, let me know. I would be my honor to help you track it down online. I think it's called Good Fences or Good Neighbors. Good Fences. Jeremy Kalinowski is the author. It's it's not very long, not a very long article. I found it really, really interesting in helping to articulate what makes Orthodoxy Orthodox as opposed to, and how liberal Orthodoxy is different from conservative movement. Any other questions or comments on, yeah?
Just, you went through a bunch of different brands, flavors of Orthodox minyanim. Did you say they were halakhic egalitarian minions that?
Halakhic egal is like a word. It's like that's the label that people use to describe themselves. People who believe in egalitarian gender stuff in the context of tefillah. Men and women participate in minyan equally. They don't consider themselves Orthodox. They don't consider themselves conservative. They feel, they're not Orthodox because they reject the authoritative poskim of Orthodoxy, and they're not conservative because, whatever, they don't feel that the movement speaks to them, or,
do they count women in the minyan?
Yeah.
For me, when somebody does that's what differentiates them.
So it's a very important difference. But again, there's a sort of symbiotic, because those people attend our shul, and we might, and they come to we have Shabbos meals, there's a lot, and people drift back and forth, maybe going to a conventional Orthodox shul and going to a halachic yigal minyan, independent minyan. I mean, that's a lot of people in this community. I go to, I see a lot of knowing nods. Right? A lot of people in this community go to attend minyanim of that sort from time to time or often, right? So it's a very, it's permeable, but I don't see it as like pushing the envelope of Orthodoxy, or because they've just rejected that label. And I think that's important. I think it's very important. I'll get to that at the end. I think it's actually important. It's not just semantics. Okay, I want to talk about religious leadership. So, when it comes to religious leadership, so Torah scholarship and religious leadership, these are really different issues, but I'm going to try to address them the same because there's a lot of commonality. Well, I want to address Torah scholarship. Okay, so the doors of the Beit Midrash are open to women in formal ways, beginning in the 70s, expanded in the 80s, into the 90s, but there is nothing, parity does not exist. I think that's just important to understand. This movement of women's Torah scholarship, it's just not, that's not true, right? And that's still, decades later, that still doesn't, it still doesn't exist. But so what you do have is, you have in the modern Orthodox world, it's not uncommon for there to be, for men and boys and girls to receive identical educations through 12th grade. Some modern Orthodox schools, not all, but some, maybe the better ones, the more progressive ones. There are some excellent like gap year programs for women, but a woman who's like very serious about her Torah scholarship is going to run out of Batei Midrash, which is appropriate for her to learn at a very young age, at a very comparably limited stage of her career. As I would say, like this was brought up. It was a long time ago. 2004. I started rabbinic school in New York, and I guess up until that point, I felt my wife and I had very comparable, opportunities to study Torah and Batei Midrash and programs that were really appropriate for our skills and our interests and supported us. And then that year, I was really still just getting started, and she had really run out of appropriate. There was really no place in the United States that was an appropriate place for her to study Torah. So she ended up, so she went and started taking graduate courses in Talmud at Yeshiva University, which was really stimulating and interesting, but wasn't really what she wanted to do. So that was sort of that, and it's better now than it was 10 years ago, but it's not dramatically better. And
Do you think that's an issue of just the point in the evolution of women's Torah scholarship that we're at, rather than intentional?
I would say every decade it gets a little bit better, right? And so you push the envelope a little bit further in terms of how many years can you remain in a, as an intelligent, ambitious, scholarly woman in an appropriate Beit Midrash environment that's going to support your Torah scholarship. And I think it gets, every decade, it gets a little bit better, an extra year is added. So maybe it's just the evolution, but it's slow, and it's very frustrating for people who are caught, on the bad side of that, right, who run out of, right, and so there are a lot of women in their 50s who are, Orthodox women who are professors because they really should have been Talmidot Chachamim or rabbis, but instead they're professors because there was nothing. They loved Judaism, and that was what they could devote themselves to. So it's definitely, you could be right. That's an optimistic view, but it has to be shared with just the acknowledgement of the pain of the women who find themselves caught in that. Like it's great to know that 10 years from now will be better, but right now, what am I going to like? Where what do I have to do? Yeah. In terms of religious leadership, that's also, so I think that's been a way, so professionalizing women's education has been a way to kind of solve that problem. So it's easier to get funding, it's easier to kind of, justify to your parents, what you're doing with your life if you I'm getting a degree at the end. So there's been an increasing number of degree programs for women that in the last 10 years, and I think they've also had I would say, some success. Yeshivat Maharat was founded in, I believe, 2009, and they had 30-something graduates. Almost all of whom I think are gainfully employed in one way or the other, in Avodat HaKodesh and serving the Jewish community in a religious fashion. And I think beyond the significance, I would say, what Yeshivat Maharat did beyond their own graduates, I think they kind of shifted the Overton window, if that's the right term. It's kind of right. I think it's a term. It's the Overton window. I don't know where it comes from. It means what's the acceptable thing to debate, right? So if maybe here's the parameters of our conversation, and then I'm going to say something that seems a little bit extreme, here's an example. I don't know, whatever. In the political example, people talk about this in politics a lot, right? So in 2016, when Bernie Sanders was advocating Medicare for all, that shifted the Overton window, and all of a sudden, something like a public option added on to the Affordable Care Act is this very mainstream conservative, right? So conservative and mainstream that it couldn't pass the Senate. Joe Lieberman was going to filibuster, the Affordable Care Act in, 10 years ago, right? But but now it's that's the mainstream option. So you shift the over. Sometimes you have something which is seems to be a little bit out there, right? Seems to be more radical or on the extreme, but it serves to shift the parameters of the debate. I think Yeshivat Maharat shifted the parameters of the debate and made titles and degrees and that kind of more structured learning environment seem much more compelling and important. And there are, since it's open, there are 3 or 4 other advanced, graduate level learning environment that are offering some form, either ordination or some sort of degree or some sort of certificate in a way that really wasn't quite this case before. And I think that's been an important shift in religious leadership. In terms of it's still very, very hard for women to turn their love of Torah into a career. I think there are a relatively large number of entry-level positions for women who love Torah to professionalize that love of Torah and present it in service of the Jewish people. It's a challenge to turn it into a career. There are, and we saw this also in the conservative movement. Right? The conservative movement ordained women for the first time, I think, in 1982. So that was, almost approaching 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. There's still enormous professional barriers that women face in the conservative movement in being hired, in congregations, in major congregations. This was a scandal a few years ago when an entire graduating class of JTS, I think, none of the women got job offers. I think it was remember this? This was, I remember reading this it was in the newspaper, sitting in my mother's apartment, I don't know, so it must have been, and talking to people about it. Within the last 10 years. So it was surprisingly recent, right? In other words, they'd been after a generation of ordaining women. They reached the point where in 2010, whatever it was, okay, there were 15 or 20 graduates from JTS that year. The men all got jobs, none of the women did. Or it was maybe not quite that extreme. It was similarly extreme. So there's actually it's one thing for a school to decide we're going to give a degree. It's another thing for a community to coalesce around accepting it. Leadership looks a little bit different from what it had looked like before, and that takes longer, and that is taking longer. So I think there are congregations like ours who employ women in positions that had been or could be the portfolio of an assistant rabbi, but there are just not that many positions like that in the country, and it's only the more progressive wing of Orthodoxy that's open to employing women in that way. There are women who are starting their own shuls, which is a model I think that in some ways is like you get to sidestep all of the, some of the like shul politics, so you start your own shul. And then there are other women who have been very successful in like other types of Avodat HaKodesh outside of the sitting HaKadosh in schools and Hillels and doing other types of Jewish community work, and that's also like a model that's expanding. There are also Orthodox women who've been able to have success outside the Orthodox community serving the Jewish people. And that's also something that ordination and degrees have enabled them to do, right? Because that was, I remember when a representative of a national Jewish organization came to Drisha when my wife was a member of the Scholars Circle and said that for a certain position we only hire rabbis, and Rose Latschauer, who at the time was the head of the said, well, would you hire our, graduates of our program? I said, no, we only hire rabbis. It's not nothing against women. It's just that we only hire rabbis for that. And that was a form of I think discrimination, that this organization had this sort of arbitrary policy when people who were comparably qualified weren't to do the work, to do the job, weren't being up. But on the other hand, maybe it was the turn for our community to step up and try to come up with ways to honor the professionalism and the dedication and the scholarship of these women. Okay, so I have actually something to show. I have this interesting, about this issue, I found some data which I thought was interesting. This is from the Nishma survey from a few years ago. Yeah. No, it's the same one. Okay. So this was a group. They did a survey of several thousand Orthodox Jews. They did it a few years ago. They did it again this year. They asked different questions. I think the survey was sent to this shul, so you may recognize these. You've answered these questions, great. Okay. So it's among modern Orthodox Jews. There's overwhelming support for classes in shirim that are on equal intellectual level, as opposed to the women's classes being fluffy, and co-ed classes supported by 80% of modern Orthodox Jews. Women-friendly mechitza, 75%. Women's shul presence, 74%. Kaddish Goma allowed even without men, that a woman can say these prayers by herself, 69%. A woman can give Dvar Torah from the bima, 65% of modern Orthodox Jews support. That's a sizable majority. The Torah passed through the women's section. Seems that 46% approve, 36% are neutral or defer to the rabbi. So that's very little opposition. In terms of
Who opposes classes on equal social?
5%? No, 7. Yeah.
Why does anyone oppose that?
Okay, so I would ask you that why then are there so many classes that are so fluffy offered to women, right? So that's
It's a terrible.
it's a what?
It's a problem.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I should say this question was only asked to people who self-identified somewhere within the spectrum of modern Orthodoxy. So.
And who chose to do the survey, right?
And who chose to take the survey. You could say the whole thing is worthless because it's an internet survey that was opt-in, but they feel that, and they hired statisticians to agree that there was some statistical value to the survey because they had so many people willing to answer it. But you're absolutely right that this could all be totally baloney because it's internet, whatever, right? Did you answer the survey when it was sent to you?
This looks kind of familiar.
Okay. What's interesting also about leadership, in terms of women having organizational leadership, 80% agree. Torah teaching, 75% agree. Torah study and scholarship, 77% support. When it comes to somewhat a role in the clergy, you have 53% agree fully or somewhat agree that women should have some role in the clergy. So that's a majority of the modern Orthodox community is supportive. When you break it down to, when you break it down by title, it drops, right? Support for women having expanded roles in the clergy with a title signifying the rabbinic authority. So 62%. So it's only 62% do not support. Okay, so it's 38% support. So that's a big decline. So from 38% of the modern Orthodox community support women with some title that suggests rabbinic authority. Maybe it has like the letter R somewhere in the title, but 53% support some sort of expanded leadership role in the synagogue context without a title that signifies some sort of rabbinic authority. So I don't know. That's where we're at. That's where we seem to be at right now as a community. I think one challenging dynamic is you could have something that's supported by 30%, 40% of your shul. Let's say if every minor Orthodox shul in the country has 30% that really are strongly in favor of female rabbis, like you'll never get a female rabbi ever hired because it's only 30% of every shul.
They should form their own shul.
So that seems to be happening. It seems to break down by like divisions within the modern Orthodoxy, like 85% of self-identified open Orthodox support, 60% of liberal modern Orthodox support, but only 27% of modern Orthodox, only 11% of centrist Orthodox, and only 6% of right centrist. So there is some division of shuls, but a lot of our shuls are, I don't know, like if we asked you if you were to raise your hand, I don't know if you probably would come out with different answers to how we would classify ourselves by these categories. Just like those of us just looking around, and from what I don't know all of you, but I know some of you, most of you. So shuls aren't so easily sorted. I think the 53% who support women working in like prominent ways in synagogues for serving in positions of religious leadership without a title that signifies rabbi, that suggests like I think room for growth. That suggests a way then you can get, maybe you could get a majority of more synagogues supportive of hiring women in this way, that allowing people to make a career out of their love of Torah and love of the Jewish people, having more generations grow up comfortable to women being sources of Torah knowledge and teachers of Torah, right? So that to me seems like maybe there's a room to grow, but this is definitely a fault line within the Orthodox community, with the most liberal elements being supportive of this and the more traditional elements of our community being opposed or even vociferously opposed. So where does that leave us? I feel really bad that I didn't share with you like a source sheet with like real Torah sources, and I don't want to be. I don't want to speak to you about sociology. I'd like to speak to you about Torah. So I want to offer like some sort of like Torah like takeaway to this entire conversation. What determines like the periphery of Orthodoxy? What determines Orthodoxy or not? I think halachic formalism might be a dead end in determining Orthodoxy, in the sense that, right, halachic formalism meaning if I can come up with a quote-unquote neutral legal argument that can justify practice as Orthodox, and if not, then it isn't. That seems to be a dead end because, do we really believe in, like, can legal texts really be interpreted entirely neutrally? And who are we going to empower to be the interpreters of the text? Like, I think the question, it's too, there's no Archimedean point where we can sort of step aside from our polemics and step aside from our values and our beliefs and our agendas and and then come up with our formal halachic reasonings. I just don't think that it's going to solve these problems and answer it for us. And in terms of like the actual like Orthodox feminist agenda, as we've described, I think halachic formalism may have played itself out. Like I don't know that like it may have accomplished all it can accomplish. That it may be that's also a possibility. So if Orthodoxy is a defined community, then communities are allowed to define their own parameters, and they can set them for themselves. I think. So that, though, then leads to kind of like a no true Scotsman kind of argument. Like partnership minyanim are not Orthodox, and anyone who endorses partnership minyanim therefore isn't Orthodox. So I can just wipe my, clean, neat, and done. But it's not an argument. It's just an assertion. It's a no true Scotsman fallacy, right? I'm just sort of declaring something and then working back from my own definition to then reinforce my definition, right? That's it's not a logical. There's a flaw in that logic. Can you nod that you understand why that's a problem? Okay. So how do you respond to a no true Scotsman? I think there are two ways that one can. One who finds oneself. I'm fully mainstream, so I'm not in this boat with you. But if I weren't, or to the extent that I aren't always, I think there are maybe two approaches to responding to this type of argument. One is civil disobedience. My teacher, Rabbi Clapper, has spoken about this for many years. It's sort of a trope he likes to return to. Legal systems have this dynamic of civil disobedience. It's a way of holding a mirror up to the authorities and saying, look what you're doing. Right? So if the way that would work in the halakha context is, so the way it works in civil disobedience, I'm a law-abiding citizen, I'm wearing a jacket, I'm wearing a tie, I'm a university student, and you're going to throw me in jail because I'm sitting at a lunch counter where you don't want me, right? That puts a mirror up to society. So you're turning a law-abiding, decent citizen into a criminal because of your laws. And look what your laws are doing. Look what this legal system is doing. And that can inspire people to change the legal system. Because if my legal system is putting these very decent young people in prison, then maybe the problem is not them, maybe the problem is our legal system. So from a halakhic standpoint, that looks like, look how, I send my kids to Orthodox schools and camps, and I'm at minyan every day, and I keep strictly kosher, and I go to the mikveh, and I do the X and Y and Z, but this issue, I'm following my own truth, and you're gonna, I'm making you turn me into a criminal as a way to show you not that I'm doing something wrong, that maybe there's something wrong with the law. So I don't know if that can work, but maybe it can, and that's one model. Another model is not the civil disobedience of I'm doing something wrong and look what your laws are doing to me, but just by kind of have the self-confidence that comes from being so very Orthodox that it becomes both preposterous for that community to be written out of Orthodoxy, and it becomes untenable. 1 second, a child is calling, excuse me. Hello? How do you know he's the male person? Yes, you can let him in. Yes. You can let him in. That's okay. Okay, I'm going to finish teaching and I come home, okay? Love you. Okay. Sorry.
How did they know he was the
Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. We're a little bit late. I'm sorry. I'm going to try to wrap up, okay?
How did they know he was the male person?
He was wearing a vest. He had a vest on. How could it be? Okay, right.
But he could be wearing eyeglasses.
How could you mistrust anyone wearing a vest? Okay, I'm sorry. I apologize. I lost track of time. I apologize. Let me say one more thing. If you have to go, you have to go. I would like to say one more thing. We did start late. So this approach is to say, again, we're so very Orthodox in our spirituality, in our religiosity, in our affiliations, in the tzedakot that we support, okay, in the way we educate our children, the way we educate ourselves, and the opportunities we seek out for tefillah and for Torah study and for mitzvah observance. That's just preposterous to say, this person isn't Orthodox because of X, Y, and Z thing they do that's a little bit different, or even a little bit more than a little bit different from what others are doing. And not only is it untenable to make that argument, it's not only preposterous, it's also untenable because we can't afford to lose these upstanding members of our community. And if my choice is between losing these upstanding members of the community or rethinking this issue, and maybe I can come up with a way to be Malamed Zchut at least, and to accommodate them within our community, then maybe I'll do that. There's some interesting, maybe an example, whatever. So there's some examples of that also. I think that's happened, in history, maybe around the issue of things that have been, I don't know, I think like a related practice maybe look at the tolerance for women uncovering their heads within like halakhic literature. You sort of reach a point where it's so ubiquitous that it pushes poskim to kind of figure out, well, why, okay, let me, in that case, since this is ubiquitous, let me figure out why it must be okay, because it's ubiquitous. Okay, because they're so very pious and frum, and they go to Moshe and they say, here our case, and so Moshe, I guess you're right, and yeah. I mean, that helps when you have a prophet. I think it makes it easy. But what would have been if the Benot Tzlachah, if they had gone with their tents and they're gonna like, we're claiming our father's field? That would have been a little different story, right? That would have been the civil disobedience model. That didn't happen. We don't know how the Torah would have described that. And finally, this is an idea that I really finally for real this time. Tamar Ross, in her book Studying the Palace of Torah, describes that it's precisely Orthodox feminists who have the most power to change the meaning of Torah, to expand the palace of Torah in her metaphor, by insisting on their feminism and insisting on their orthodoxy, by not compromising on my sense of self and my sense of identity and what it means, to be a woman and how I see myself in that way, and not be willing to and also to insist that I'm a pious Orthodox Jew who is devoted to the Torah and devoted to mitzvot. Just that, holding those pieces of identity inside is what causes the Torah to expand, to include these new ways of seeing the world. Like, that's how the Torah grows. The Torah grows through history in a Rav Kookian, Hegelian sense, and that's done by people, right? Just as, and Zionism is a great parallel case, right? Of like where we, in the space of a generation, we dramatically and radically transformed what it meant to be a Jew, and how a Jew relates to history, how a Jew relates to exercise of our own power, and taking ownership over that, and taking ownership over fate. The most radical, dramatic revolution in I think in 2,000 years of Jewish history, and somehow we all figured out that that's what the Torah wanted all along. That was the original vision, right? And we all say that totally unsubconsciously, and we believe it. Okay, that's how successful it was. And so that can happen with other issues as well, right? By insisting on our values and who we are and our identity, and also like insisting that we're doing so as Orthodox Jews who are faithful to the Torah and faithful to mitzvah. Okay, thank you for staying late. I apologize. Have a good night. Stay warm. Next week we're doing sexuality.
Okay.